Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Mark Leonard, who is the co-founder and director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, the first pan-European think tank. His focus is on geopolitics, geoeconomics, China, EU, and institutions. He's also the host of the podcast, Mark Leonard's World in 30 Minutes, and author of the new book, The Age of Unpeace, How Connectivity Causes Conflict. Thank you for joining the podcast, Mark. How are things in the UK in this age of unpeace?
Well, the weather's been pretty great the last few days, so that's hiding a lot of the simmering uncertainty about the COVID world, about Britain's role after Brexit, and also a lot of angst that was unleashed by the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's funny. It seems most of the guests that I have that are from Britain always answer that it's gray in Britain. Before I get to my first question, then I just wanted to remind listeners to subscribe to the email list, Telegram, Twitter, and other platforms. And as I'm doing this full time, your donations are very much appreciated. Mr. Leonard, so in your book, which I just finished reading and which I enjoyed very much, you say networks or global connectivity have become weapons. Connections that knit the world together are driving it apart. In the intros of your book, you paint a picture of, for example, British food supply problems as a result of French border closures, Turkey using migration as a weapon against the EU, U.S. regulators banning Chinese companies, Iran seizing tankers in response to sanctions. It all kind of makes sense. It's kind of like a chipper family gathering that can often end in argument. It goes against the grain of the globalization story we have been hearing for decades. You say we can't have a globalized planet or one world, that having such an open world is causing problems. Perhaps you can kind of lay out your main thesis, and then we can drill down from there.
With great pleasure. I am somebody whose life has been enormously enhanced by globalization and by connectivity on every plane. My personal life, my family is spread out all over the world because my mum's side were German Jews, many of whom were killed in the Holocaust. Other people have settled in different places. My father's was British, and he was sent away from home at the age of 8 during the Second World War, and his father fought in the First World War. So the fact that we don't have wars and that people are bound together in new ways has been wonderful. I have a think tank with offices in 7 different countries. I travel pre-COVID 150 days a year. I love food and culture from other parts of the world. So in my life, connectivity and these connections has been almost an unalloyed good. However, what we realized with the Brexit referendum and with the election of Trump is that many people in many countries have actually felt that all the things which I saw as giving me greater opportunities, giving me a greater sense of security, are in fact pathways to insecurity and are seen as threats, whether they're threats from terrorism, from migration, which can drive down wages in certain sectors or put pressure on public services, even if it contributes to economic growth in the main. Whether it's about cyber attacks, whether it's about jobs going overseas, there are all sorts of different channels where connectivity has a dark side. That is not something which is entirely new, but what is, I think, a bit newer and more difficult to digest is firstly that connectivity seems to be actually creating a lot of the tensions between different people, giving them reasons to fight each other. And I kind of look at how our connected world has created a sense of an epidemic of envy as people compare themselves to other players, has often ended up segregating our societies into different filter bubbles that have very little contact with each other, and has also led to a widespread lack of control. And those things feed into a different kind of politics, which is a politics fueled by identity, by envy, and by taking back control and pushing back on internationalism. But even more dramatic than that is the fact that globalization has given countries a whole series of different channels to conflict with each other. And you mentioned in your intro some of the things which have happened in recent times, where the links which tie different countries together, instead of creating peace and harmony, are in fact providing tools for power politics. And in the book, I use this metaphor of a marriage going wrong, and say that globalization is a bit like a marriage that goes wrong. So in a marriage, all the things that bind you together during the good times become the ways that you hurt each other when things go wrong. So who gets custody over the kids, who gets to keep the pet dog, who has the holiday home. These are ways that a couple that doesn't get on anymore hurts each other and tries to have influence over one another. And with globalization, it's not the dog or the children or the family home that is weaponized, but it is, in fact, all the different points of contact that we have with each other, whether it's economic links, where we're seeing a rise in sanctions, in export restrictions, people bullying each other with access to vaccines and masks and other kinds of things like that. Whether it's about global infrastructure, and we've seen big debates about whether China should be allowed to build 5G networks in different places, whether Huawei could be allowed into our economies, whether it's a question to do with migration. Very recently, we've been hearing about how Belarus is encouraging Afghan refugees to go into Poland and Lithuania to put pressure on the governments there. Or the question of the internet, as you were saying, social media and have provided pathways for new kinds of misinformation campaigns, for attempts to interfere in elections. And finally, even the international institutions have been reinvented. Rather than them creating greater harmony, there's more and more talk of lawfare, as people use international law as a way of hurting one another. And that set of behaviors, I think, is something which is growing in an exponential way and is creating a world which is not at war in a sort of classic sense. So it's not the kind of war which my grandfather got sent to when he was in the trenches in World War One. But it's also not really peace, because every year tens of thousands of people are being killed, millions of people are suffering economically, hundreds of millions are seeing their elections interfered with in different ways. And that's why I talk about this era as the Age of Unpeace, because it's not war according to conventional terms, but at the same time, there's a huge amount of violence and suffering which has been unleashed through the weaponization of globalization. And, we're just at the beginning of this. And if you look at what happens with COVID, what's happening with climate change, you can see how these great planetary problems are, rather than bringing countries together in search of collective solutions, are providing new platforms for countries to hurt each other and to compete for relative advantage. And the consequences of that could be absolutely catastrophic.
I would just add something. Another example of what you discussed yesterday was quite shocking, that Justin Trudeau in Canada just announced that foreigners will not be allowed to purchase property in Canada for at least the next 2 years, which is just the perfect example of what you discuss in your book, all of these restrictions that are now coming. I mean, I'm in Mexico, and I know a lot of Mexicans that have escaped to Canada, and I'm sure some of them will have been wanting to buy property, but I guess that's off the table for now. And you're kind of echoing one of the sentiments of my recent guest, Russian academic Artyom Lukin, who discussed how we're entering kind of into an era of closed borders or isolationism. And yeah, I think you're right. This integration, this globalization that we've had for the past few decades has brought us together, but it's now amplifying our differences in many different ways, as you discuss in your book, through the networks, internet, economic ways we're tied together, and so on. And in your book, you talk about the three biggest players, which are the U.S., China, and Europe, the EU. The three have different views, weapons, and philosophies. The shape of our global order will be defined by the battle between these three empires of connectivity. Dramas that are meant to strike once a century seem to afflict us every few minutes. You write, you even say that we're not far off from George Orwell's dystopian vision of a world split between Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. Could you tell us a bit more about the big three in the Age of Unpeace?
Certainly. So loads of countries have found ways of weaponizing and instrumentalizing connectivity. You mentioned a lot of them, Turkey using migration, Iran seizing Korean tankers, Russia trolling and using disinformation. But none of those powers can change the whole system. And there are only three countries which have got enough connections, enough money. Sorry, three, they're not countries because the European Union is not a country. Three political organizations which have enough power, connections, and resources to try and change the way that the whole system works. And they are the US, China, and the European Union. And what is really striking about them is that all three are going through a revolution in how they think about globalization and how they think about their role within it. But they're going in quite different ways, and they're conceptualizing the challenges in slightly different ways. They think about power in different ways. They've got different philosophies. So in the US, for example, you have a period of major rethinking about globalization, epitomized by the slogan, Buy American. A lot of people thought that Donald Trump was a kind of outlier and that when he left, the US would go back to normal. But what we're seeing under Biden is a continuing of this process of rethinking America's role in the global system. And typically, the US has been one of the big builders of the network world that we're living in, a big champion for globalization. It's where the internet is born. But at the same time, the US has always had quite an instrumental approach to these sorts of connections. And what they tend to focus on is to think about how the networks are structured. So there are lots of ties between different nodes in a network, but some ties are more important than others. And you have these hubs where vast amounts of traffic goes through, which can be give you superpowers. So in the US, for example, there are two kind of particular hubs which have given America superpowers. One is the dollar. So 96% of global foreign exchange goes through three banks in New York and uses the dollar. And the US has managed to weaponize its control of the dollar in order to impose its political preferences on others. We saw that with the Iran sanctions, where countries like the European Union were forced to abide by policies which went completely against their own policies and even against international law. Because of the weaponization of the dollar. Another very powerful example is the internet. A huge amount of traffic goes through a number of cables and which are based in the US. And the NSA was very quick to work out what it could do with that and has mined a lot of that data. And we saw through Snowden's revelations how much the US had used its control of the internet to enhance its intelligence over what was going on in other places. So in America, there is a kind of focus on these hubs and an attitude of trying to use sort of data mining and gatekeeping, keeping countries in and out of the dollar system as a way of asserting its power. And increasingly, they're also worried that their era of being able to control everything and to set the rules for the whole world is coming to an end. And that's leading them to be a bit less universalist. And rather than going for institutions which involve everyone, there's an attempt to try and build a parallel world order with like-minded democratic countries and to have economic networks organized around that, because they fear that China is becoming such a powerful center of economic activity that it could end up subverting the rules which the US has been trying to advance. In China, you've also got a big rethinking going on about globalization. I mean, in some ways, unlike in the West, the Chinese have always thought about connections and connectivity as a central part of power. If you look at sort of Confucian philosophy and you go back through all the different regimes over the last few thousands of years, the Chinese have thought a lot about power in terms of these connections. And a lot of Chinese international relations experts talk about how China has a relational model for international relations. So rather than just looking at the players, who the different powers are and what the hubs are, they look at the links, the ties that bind all of them together. And in the Chinese system and in the Chinese mentality, so they're less focused on the hubs, but more thinking about how many ties link you to other players and how central are you to these networks. And that comes from this belief of China as the middle kingdom around which everybody else kind of rotates. And you have this tributary system in Asia where all countries are bound into China. And nowadays, you're seeing China trying to build a new tributary system through the Belt and Road Initiative, where 65 countries around the world are being kind of linked into China through digital networks, through roads and pipelines and railways and ports. And the idea is that this will allow China to become more and more central and be able to decide how to handle its relations with other players based on how friendly they are towards China. At the same time, the Chinese are very, very nervous about globalization being used to undermine China. They got a big shock when Donald Trump put big Chinese companies like ZTE on an entities list, which meant that they couldn't get access to key components like chips and processors, which would not be able to be produced in China. So China's going from a kind of model of export-led growth to a new philosophy of globalization, which Xi Jinping has called dual circulation, where you both look at the internal Chinese economy and you see how you can make China more self-sufficient, using its domestic consumption more, and trying to work out how you can conquer a lot of the different elements of the economy of the future with different technologies like artificial intelligence, batteries, other areas which are going to be central to the future of China, and try and make China as self-sufficient as possible in those areas. And at the same time, to think about the second wheel, which is external circulation, China's links with the rest of the world, and to try and reconfigure that so that it's done, that the economic links are organized in ways which make other countries more dependent on China than it is on them, so that China can actually use globalization to advance its interests. And then the European Union is the sort of third big block. And I think with the European Union, it's focused a bit less on the hubs and on the ties and more on the individual nodes within the system and what rules they follow. And the EU is obsessed with rules. The European Union itself is a kind of legal construction. To join it, you have to implement 80,000 pages of legislation which govern everything from the composition of soybeans and to lawnmower sound emissions, but also have a lot of quite political ideas within them. And the EU has basically been trying to export its rules to the rest of the world. Every time it enlarges, countries are forced to absorb these 80,000 pages, but it also forces other countries to abide by them. A classic example was the regulations for privacy on the internet called GDPR, where the European Union forced other people or tried to force other people to abide by these standards, even if they were based outside of the EU. And I think what you're going to increasingly see is these three great powers of connectivity rubbing up against each other, trying to advance their own ideas about how the internet could be organized, but also fighting against each other for control of these different networks. And it leads to a lot of instability. So it's not quite about globalization going into reverse, because there's so much at stake and people benefit so much from the links within each other, between each other. But at the same time, because it's increasingly being weaponized and instrumentalized, it feels quite risky, and that is creating a lot of unease and is creating a lot of problems. And we're seeing that in a lot of sectors of the economy as global supply chains are being undermined by this kind of political competition, and it's affecting the car industry. It's affecting what you can buy in supermarkets. It's potentially something which could have enormous consequences for ordinary people, as well as for grand strategists and policymakers who sit in chancelleries around the world.
Yeah, so you're talking about China, and that was one of my biggest takeaways from your book, which I got a lot of insights. Was your analysis on the U.S. China relationship? You, for example, spoke to a professor on one of your many trips to China who said, quote, when China goes to war with the USA, they hope Europe will at least stay neutral, end quote. This has been a burning question of mine. Is China integrating with the West, or is it truly turning away and becoming a sovereign? You just kind of discussed that dual circulation. And then becoming sovereign, turning a bit away, which would perhaps increase the chances of conflict with the U.S. Like, people talk about war with the U.S. Like this professor, and in the West now, the hawks are talking about this more and more. You say China hasn't followed the script written by the techno-utopians, that the CCP hasn't been swept aside by the internet. But there's also a fascinating theory that you discuss in your book, where you talk about Peter Thiel's intellectual hero, René Girard, and this theory that China and the US are increasingly becoming mimetic doubles of each other as they compete more strenuously to be the world's number one power and mirror each other's strengths in order to advance that goal. They will inevitably become more alike, and their mutual antipathy will grow. The distinction between both systems is blurring, making neither possible in its pure form. A sort of convergence where China absorbs, I guess, some aspects of the Western capitalist or development strategy, as we've seen so far, but kind of remains authoritarian, and America simply becomes, I guess, more centralized and authoritarian, which I personally, as an American, fear we're kind of slowly witnessing now. What are your thoughts on this aspect of China and this convergence between the two?
So that is one of the big takeaways from the way that I learned to think about connectivity, is that there is this sort of widespread sense that we're on the verge of a new Cold War. The thing which splits China from America are their irreconcilable differences. The US is the ultimate embodiment of the free world. China is developing this digital authoritarianism and stands for closed societies, and that ideological fissure between these totally different universes is going to define geopolitics in the future. And what I found actually is that increasingly what seems to be happening is that China and the US are in many ways becoming more similar rather than more different. And as they become more similar, the tensions are going up. So if you look at the kind of long story of the last few decades, 20 years ago, China and America were really different. One was the kind of ultimate advanced economy. The other was a developing country. China was the manufacturer of the world. The US was the kind of consumer of last resort. The US was the kind of big spender. China was the big saver. And, in all sorts of different ways, they mirrored each other, and they got on pretty well, actually. So well that people like Neil Ferguson talked about Chimerica, that there was a single economic entity that was being created. And nowadays, if you look across those different dimensions, what you see is that China and America have become much more similar in all sorts of different ways. So if you look at the size of the economies, the size of the kind of middle classes in the different countries, the amount of domestic consumption they have, they're becoming more and more similar. They're increasingly competing with each other to be the kind of global trend setters in lots of different areas, whether it's driverless cars or AI or other kinds of areas. And they're also increasingly active in similar places, whether it's in Latin America or in Asia or in other parts of the world. As the competition between the two of them becomes more and more real, and the relations get worse and worse, the two countries are increasingly starting to mirror one another in order to be competitive with one another. So China has long been very suspicious of American tech companies and platforms, and has all but outlawed the presence of American tech platforms within China. The US has traditionally been very open to Chinese investment and allowed these Chinese companies to come in. But that's now changed. A whole slew of new regulations have come in, which is basically making it very difficult for Chinese companies to work within the US. The president himself got involved in the future of TikTok and forced them to sell off their US operation. Companies like Grindr, which is a kind of a gay hookup site, it was deemed to be against American national security for a Chinese company to own that, so they were forced to sell it. And you're seeing a sort of decoupling going on in the technological realm in the US, which mirrors in many ways what the Chinese had done before. And in other areas, you're seeing China becoming much more like America, whether it's rethinking its international footprint, opening naval bases in different parts of the world. So you're seeing a sort of gradual convergence as the two countries look at each other, mirror each other, and copy each other. And that when it comes to particularly things like the future of technology, you see these sort of strange shadow debates, which are quite different. I'm not saying that China and America are identical. I'm just saying that there is a process of convergence going on, which is leading to greater tension. So if you look at the Chinese internet and the debates about surveillance and the future of China as a digital dictatorship, a lot of the debates about ways that data is being misused and being used in a predatory way have their mirror image in debates about surveillance capitalism in the US. And as a result, what you're seeing is a kind of muddying of the waters, which is quite complicated and is worrying people, a lot of people in the US who fear that in their quest to remain competitive with China, some of the most attractive elements of America's open society might end up being subverted, whether it's because of this move towards a much more mercantilist economic model, a lot more kind of state planning, but also, kicking Chinese researchers out of the country, kicking down on research networks and things like that.
Yeah, I'm just curious. That kind of leads into my next question: how you might feel about that, or the people that you work with, or that you meet. When you talk about the age of unpeace, we're not talking about conventional war, nuclear war, military conflicts, as you said. It's about migration and things like this. All these different things being used as weapons. For me personally, I guess my greatest fear would be the misuse of what if we're talking about the age of unpeace and all of these things that can be used as weapons, for me, the biggest fear is technology, precisely that, cyber attacks, this is cyber pandemic that's been talked about, cyber disruptions, and this sort of digital dictatorship model, social credit system, which you describe in China, coming to the West. This week it was reported, that Russia is banning VPNs and email services. Actually, my email service is banned in Russia. My Russian guest that I was trying to get on, that I spoke to last week, he couldn't respond to my email because it was blocked by the Russian government. So I had to use my Gmail to speak with him. And so now we're seeing, and we saw as well, the US just took down Iran's Press TV domain, but we're starting to see in the U.S., for example, I'm an American citizen. I haven't done anything wrong. My Patreon was terminated a few months ago. My Facebook page is restricted. I'm hearing about innocent Americans having their bank accounts terminated for their political or religious views and being put on no-fly lists. And so it seems like that's my biggest fear. What would be, what do you think about this, and what would be your biggest fear in the age of unpeace, short of conventional war?
Well, I think all the things you're talking about are symptoms of this increasingly uncertain world where people are using the ties that bind us together to exercise political power and to get ahead themselves and to hold other people back. I think some of the most existential risks that people have talked about, some of them are things which are going to be deliberate. So, there are all sorts of, the libraries have been filled with some of the cyber attacks which could take place. So far, we're lucky that there haven't been any kind of existential risks which have been unleashed by cyber attacks, but there are all sorts of horrendous scenarios which could take place where people could take down power grids or interfere with nuclear weapons and kill, large numbers of people in different places. I think you could also see enormous economic destruction being unleashed through if there is a real weaponization of the global trade system or the finance system. You could have a lot of people losing their jobs, potentially finding access to food and to other kinds of things undermined because our global supply chains are so vulnerable to these kinds of interferences. There are a whole series of things which could happen, with other kinds of infrastructure being taken down, whether it's, 5G networks or access to energy or things like that being kind of disrupted. But maybe the most scary thing is the way that people are instrumentalizing global problems. And one of the things that I was hoping in the 90s is that our politics would recognize the fact that a lot of the biggest challenges that we faced as a world were not about fights between different countries, but it was things which affected us all together, whether it's the climate emergency or more recently COVID. And the hope is that that would lead to cooperative solutions and attempts to deal with these things together. But instead, because of the dynamics that we've been talking about, the way that connectivity seems to make people think more about their own identities and how they can compete with others, rather than sort of rising to the challenge and coming together to deal with these things. People seem to be playing games to get ahead themselves and doing other people down. And there is a huge danger with the climate emergency that countries could end up trying to go for relative advantage rather than coming up with a common solution. The pandemic is also quite scary to think about how that could develop if large parts of the world don't get access to vaccines and find that they become enormous breeding grounds for new variants, which could end up potentially overwhelming humanity. So I think that's the sort of third type of issues, is us, rather than dealing with existential risks together in a responsible way, that we end up squabbling amongst ourselves and finding that things can get out of hand. And you could have a layering of these different things, with cyber attacks coming together with an economic depression, coming together with a kind of climate emergency, with large flows of people being driven from their homes, and that also being kind of weaponized. And that really is the sort of nightmare scenario, that all of these things come together in a perfect storm of connectivity conflict.
Just a quick thought on your most recent article that you wrote some days ago on Afghanistan. You've commented that the end of the US-led forever war in Afghanistan will not bring peace because the methods that countries use to attack each other have changed, that the world has entered a new age of perpetual competition among powerful states, brutal geopolitical competition, as you described. And so you've kind of, you said that it resembles a loveless marriage. You've said that previously. And, we're seeing China, Russia, Iran moving into the void left by the Americans in Kabul. If we take, Afghanistan as an example in the age of unpeace, what are your thoughts just on Afghanistan and, what might transpire in the future there?
So I think, one thing to be aware of is that it is because the Biden team are very aware of this new world, which I've been describing, that they were so desperate to get out of the old one. And Afghanistan, in many ways, was a sort of legacy of a different world order. When 9/11 happened, the US was at the center of the world and was the kind of avatar of this project of building a liberal international order around the US, where democracy and liberalism could be spread to every corner of the world. The fact that Biden was so desperate to get out and did it in such a brutal way, I think is a recognition that era is over, and that in the future, the big challenges which he is going to face are not about dealing with terrorism in the plains of Central Asia, but it's more about the weaponization of globalization and these connectivity conflicts between China and America and other powers that I've been talking about. And one of the reasons that he was so desperate to get out of Afghanistan was so that he could start to make America competitive for this new world. But equally, you can see how the way that Afghanistan has developed over the last few weeks and some of the things that come out of it are reflections of this new world as well. So it's quite different to the last time that the Taliban took over Afghanistan, in the 90s, because, first of all, they managed to do it without fighting at all. And that, I think, has got a lot to do with this new information environment where they could weaponize information and made it very easy to scare the Afghan army into a sense of into acquiescence, and then they didn't put up a fight. So that was a very striking difference from the last time the Taliban came to power. But also, a lot of the debates now are about using different types of connectivity as a way of exercising power. So there have been lots of articles, which I mentioned before, about how President Lukashenko in Belarus is trying to weaponize migration out of Afghanistan and to push back against Europeans. There have been all sorts of discussions about whether the US is going to be able to use its control over the financial system and Afghanistan's access to money as a way of re-establishing some of the control that it lost as a result of withdrawing its troops. There are all these questions about China and how China relates to Afghanistan and how this and Pakistan, which relates to these kind of questions of connectivity. So you're seeing how even in a place like Afghanistan, which is seen in many ways as the last remnant of a kind of old world, is operating according to these new principles of unpeace.
And there was an article that said that the Taliban used WhatsApp to make the Afghan army think that they're kind of like ominous everywhere, which I guess helped them come quickly to power. Just a few more questions. You said that most of the world's population does not live in the U.S., China, or the EU, such as myself for the moment. You call this the fourth world. For me, it seems the Americas seem destined to follow the diktats of the U.S. with some China thrown in, while parts of Africa and Asia will be influenced by China with some EU and a dash of US thrown in. Just your thoughts on the fourth world, as you call it.
So, in some ways, if I'm right that we're moving into these three empires of connectivity, it feels a bit like the sort of echoes of the Cold War, where you had these two blocks that were kind of competing with each other, and then you had a large swathe of countries, the second world, who were kind of non-aligned, who were squeezed between the superpowers, and found it quite difficult to organize their existence. I think in some ways, the fourth world now is in a much better state than the second world during the Cold War, because the world is a bit more orderly, and also because a lot of countries are increasingly going to try and arbitrage these other regimes and use that to extract favors and to maximize their say over their own affairs. And we'll see how successful they are in doing that. In Asia, countries have often tended to bandwagon with China economically, but in security terms with the US, and that's now proving a bit more uncomfortable, and both China and America are trying to get them to choose which side they're on. So I think we're going to see a quite uncomfortable period for the fourth world, where different countries are squeezed, and where attempts are made by the great powers to kind of force them to choose. But at the same time, there are new opportunities for middle-ranking powers, which we've seen. If you look at Turkish foreign policy, at the foreign policy of the UAE, of Saudi Arabia, of Iran, of Russia, as the US recalibrates its position in many parts of the world, and China kind of gets ready for its competition with the US, there is a vacuum which can be filled, and which creates, I think, quite a lot of room for activist middle powers. So I suspect there'll be, in this age of unpeace, there'll be quite a lot of messiness with maybe less of a kind of monogamous attachment to particular sectors, and more of a sort of era of free love, where different countries are trying to build relationships with one another, and certainly until the kaleidoscope settles down, it will be quite a complicated world where many countries try and maintain lots of different relationships with each other and see what space they can carve out for themselves in this world where connectivity is being weaponized.
Yeah, and before, I guess, getting a final thought from you, final say, I thought listeners might be interested in the ECFR. I think it was a year or two ago, I interviewed former director of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Chatham House, Victor Bulmer Thomas. My understanding is that the Royal Institute was created in the early 20th century, followed by its American cousin, the CFR, and I think you co-founded the ECFR in 2007. Could you just tell us anything about the history of the the European Council on Foreign Relations, and the work that you do today?
With great pleasure. So, yeah, we were set up in the 21st century rather than in the 20th century. And therefore, what we tried to do is to focus on a lot of the big challenges of our era. So we do a lot of work on trying to understand how different people think in different parts of the world. So we have a lot of active programs on China and Asia, or on wider Europe, which looks at Russia and Turkey and the post-Soviet space. We have a big program on the Middle East and a program on Africa. But the big difference between the European Council on Foreign Relations and some of these other councils on foreign relations you talk about is that we're a pan-European organization, and part of the hope is to try and get Europeans to look at the world together in a more outward-looking way. And therefore, part of our goal, as well as understanding the world outside, is to get Europeans to engage with one each other across different capitals. So we have offices in Berlin, Paris, Rome, Madrid, Warsaw, Sofia, London. And we have our team of researchers who is based around these different offices. We also have a council with about 300 leading politicians, statesmen, intellectuals, powerful women from the worlds of business and diplomacy, who meet once a year as a group, but who also form part of this embryonic strategic community. And we were slightly inspired by the model of the Council on Foreign Relations in the 20th century that helped the US go from being an introverted giant to a global superpower. And our hope is that by getting different people from around Europe to talk to each other and to share their ideas about the world, we can start getting Europeans to play a more constructive role on the world stage, and to use some of the assets that they have with this huge market, with these large levels of wealth and spending on defense and on diplomacy, to actually play a more constructive role on global problems, and to engage in a more effective way with other powers. Sorry about that dog.
Yeah, don't worry. I've got an orchestra of dogs in my neighborhood. Luckily, they're quiet right now. Any final thought to leave us with, then?
Well, I think the main thing is we just went through the very top headline. So if you're interested in finding out more, by the Age of Unpeace, how connectivity causes conflict, which you can get from Amazon and all good bookshops around the world, I hope.
Yeah, I'll include the links below, and a lot of interesting people have left reviews. I've seen Martin Jacques and Niall Ferguson and others. So you're on Twitter at Mark H. Leonard. The website is ecfr.eu. Apart from the book, is there any other website or project you'd like us to know about?
I think you mentioned everything, but you also mentioned my podcast, which is Mark Leonard's World in 30 Minutes. If you've enjoyed this conversation, you might want to check that out. We'd love to hear from you, and I think it might be a good complement to your existing podcast, which you're listening on if you are interested in international affairs.
All right, the Age of Unpeace. I think we'll be in for quite a ride, as you detail in the book. So check out the book, everyone, and follow Mark's work. Thank you, Mr. Leonard, for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thank you very much. It's been great fun.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast interview. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list through which you can receive an update of every new podcast, as well as a long list of key news headlines once a week. We're being heavily censored. YouTube has deleted some of our videos, and we currently have one strike. Patreon has terminated our account. Facebook has restricted our page, and Reddit has been deleting posts. Our favorite social media channels are Telegram and Twitter. The best places to watch the podcast beyond YouTube are on Odyssey, BitChute, and Brighteon. The best places to listen to the podcast are on SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, Google, or on any other podcast app. To help keep this podcast alive, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and wherever else. Subscribe to all our platforms and leave a donation if possible via Subscribestar, PayPal, Bitcoin, or Ethereum. You can also find us on MeWe, Minds, Gab, Float, VK, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thanks for listening.